The endless train. Every night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., Jonathan would hear the distant sound of a train's whistle. It didn't matter where he was, his apartment in the city, his parents' house in the suburbs, or even a hotel room in another state, the train would find him. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence, but the more he tried to ignore it, the louder the whistle became. One evening, unable to sleep and driven by curiosity, Jonathan decided to find the source of the sound. He followed the tracks that ran through the outskirts of town, noticing that they were old and overgrown, as if they hadn't been used in decades. But the whistle was unmistakable, growing nearer with each step. He finally reached a dilapidated station, long abandoned, yet the sound of the approaching train was deafening now. The clock at the station was frozen at 2:17 a.m. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay as Jonathan stepped onto the platform. As the train finally came into view, he was shocked to see it was not just any train. It was ancient, its carriages made of rotting wood and iron, its windows blackened. The door of the nearest carriage creaked open, inviting him inside. Compelled by an unseen force, Jonathan stepped in. The interior was eerily silent, and he realized with growing horror that the seats were occupied by shadowy figures, their faces obscured by darkness. As he moved further down the aisle, he felt their cold, lifeless eyes follow him. Suddenly, the train jerked forward, and Jonathan was thrown into a seat. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. The train picked up speed, hurtling through the night, faster and faster, as if it was running from something or towards something. Jonathan's heart raced as he realized the train wasn't stopping. The landscape outside became a blur, the world around him dissolving into darkness. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The other passengers remained silent, their gazes fixed on him. Panic set in as Jonathan understood the terrible truth. This was a journey with no end. The train was bound to an endless track, doomed to travel forever in the void between worlds. Jonathan's last coherent thought was a desperate plea for escape, but it was too late. The train had claimed him just as it had claimed so many before. His consciousness faded, merging with the shadows around him, becoming one of the many lost souls trapped on the endless train. The mirror's voice. Emma had always found solace in old things. Books, records, furniture. There was something comforting about the history they carried, the stories they held. So when she found an antique mirror at a flea market, she didn't hesitate to buy it. The vendor warned her that it was from a cursed estate, but Emma laughed it off as a sales tactic. The mirror was beautiful, with an ornate, gilded frame and a perfectly smooth surface. Emma hung it in her bedroom, admiring how it made the room feel larger and more elegant. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint whispering. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened closely, she realized the sound was coming from the mirror. Curious and a little unsettled, Emma got up and approached the mirror. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and she could make out words now. It was her own voice, but distorted, echoing from the glass. The voice was pleading, desperate, asking for help. Emma recoiled in fear, but the voice continued, growing louder until it was almost a scream. It begged her to listen, to understand. "I'm trapped," it cried. "Please set me free." Terrified, Emma tried to cover the mirror with a blanket, but the voice only grew more frantic. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. Emma watched in horror as her reflection twisted, morphing into a version of herself that was gaunt and pale, eyes hollow and filled with despair. The reflection mouthed the words, "Let me out." Before she could react, a hand shot out from the mirror, grabbing her wrist with an icy grip. Emma screamed as she was pulled toward the glass, her body halfway through the surface. She struggled, but the force was too strong. The last thing she saw before being dragged into the darkness was her own horrified face, distorted and fading into oblivion. The next morning, the mirror was found shattered on the floor. Emma was gone, but in the shards of glass, if you listened closely, you could hear a faint whisper. A voice, desperate and pleading, begging for release. The Watchers in the Woods. Ryan had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and supernatural tales were nothing more than nonsense to him. So when his friends dared him to spend a night alone in the old forest known as the Whispering Woods, he accepted without hesitation. The forest had a dark reputation. People who ventured too far and often didn't return, or if they did, they came back changed, haunted. With a flashlight and a sense of arrogance, Ryan entered the woods at dusk. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, as if reaching for him. As the sun set, the woods grew unnervingly silent. There were no birds, no insects, only the sound of his footsteps crunching on the leaves. Ryan made camp in a small clearing and settled in for what he assumed would be a boring night. But as the hours passed, he began to feel uneasy. The silence was oppressive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made his heart race. Around midnight, the silence was broken by a low whisper. Ryan froze, his flashlight beam dancing across the trees, but there was nothing there. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent, surrounding him. It was unintelligible, a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others angry. Panic set in, and Ryan decided he'd had enough. He packed up his things and started to leave, but the whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. He quickened his pace, but the voices were relentless, echoing in his mind, overwhelming him. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and Ryan tumbled into a pit. His flashlight shattered on impact, plunging him into darkness. The whispering was deafening now, and as his eyes adjusted, he saw them, dozens of eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, watching him from the shadows. Ryan screamed, scrambling to climb out of the pit, but the walls were too steep. The eyes moved closer, and he could make out the shapes of figures, their faces pale and twisted with malice. They were the lost souls, the ones who had ventured too far into the woods and never returned. As they closed in, Ryan realized with horror that the stories were true. The Whispering Woods were alive, and it had claimed him. The last thing he felt was the cold touch of the Watchers as they dragged him into the darkness, his screams swallowed by the whispers. The Forgotten Door. In a quiet, unassuming neighborhood stood an old house that had been abandoned for years. The locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones about the strange happenings within its walls. But to Anna, it was just an old house, an opportunity. She had recently started a YouTube channel exploring abandoned places, and this house was the perfect find. Armed with her camera and flashlight, Anna entered the house one evening, ready to document whatever she could find. The air inside was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. As she explored, she noticed something odd. Every door in the house was locked. Every door except one. In the basement, hidden behind a pile of debris, was a small wooden door, its paint chipped and faded. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong there. Anna's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to open it. The door led to a narrow staircase, descending deep into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around her. At the bottom, she found a large, empty room with stone walls. The room was bare, except for a single chair in the center and a mirror on the far wall. Anna approached the mirror, her reflection staring back at her in the dim light. But as she watched, her reflection began to change. The face in the mirror twisted into a grotesque version of herself, eyes wide with terror, mouth stretched into a silent scream. She backed away, but the reflection followed, stepping out of the mirror. Paralyzed with fear, Anna could only watch as the figure reached out to her, its hand cold and clammy. It spoke in a voice that was not hers, telling her of the horrors that had taken place in the room, of the souls trapped within the house, and how they would never let her leave. Desperation took hold, and Anna ran back up the stairs, slamming the door behind her. But when she reached the top, she found herself not in the basement, but in the same room she had just fled. The mirror was there, the chair, and the door behind her. It was as if the house itself had shifted, trapping her in a never-ending loop. As the figure in the mirror moved closer, Anna realized with dawning horror that there was no escape. The house had claimed her, and she would be just another lost soul, forgotten in the darkness.